So, exciting news, this has finally come out in paperback in the UK. So, any notion I had of doing a reading prompt this week, totally out the window, had to stop everything I was doing and read this book. So, come and join me and find out what I thought. Hi, welcome back to Bookish Brummy. My name's Mel and I like to review books. So, every week I always do a video where I round up all of the books that I've read in the last week. And for the month of June, I've basically been doing a reading prompt every week, and then I've been following that reading prompt and then telling you guys the next week about what I've been read and what I think of those books. Now, the reading prompt I was kind of going to set for this week sort of fell apart because two things really. One, I was going to do a new read, like a new book that's coming out, but I had misjudged when that book is actually coming out, and it's coming out at the beginning of July. So that's going to have to wait until July for me to do that. But then when I was in Sainsbury's, I saw that Never Flinch has finally come out in paperback, and I've been waiting for this because I'm a massive Holly Gibney fan. So this was published last year in 2025, and it's Stephen King's latest book. He does have another book coming out later this year because he has now completed the Talisman trilogy that he was writing with Peter Straub. So I believe that's coming out probably around about October time. But this is currently his latest book. And this is part of his crime collection that he's been doing that features a character called Holly Gibney. Now, I know there's a bit of contention with Holly Gibney. Some Stephen King fans love her and some really don't like her. I really like Holly. I think she's a great character, and I've really enjoyed watching her character grow from the very first time we met her in Mr. Mercedes and then all the way up into this book. So I think if you're interested in reading the Holly Gibney books, I'd say she does start out as a smaller character. She's not the main character in the book in Mr. Mercedes. And then that trilogy plays out with Bill Hodges being the main character. And Holly is kind of a secondary character in those books. But after that trilogy, which is Mr. Mercedes, End of Watch and Finders Keepers, although it's Finders Keepers and then End of Watch. Then after that book, Holly sort of becomes a character of her own. So there is a story in the If It Bleeds collection. And that's basically Holly starting out on her own in her first sort of story. And then I think Stephen King really got into that idea. So then he wrote the book Holly, which I'll put that on the screen now as well, which saw Holly taking control of investigations at the Finders Keepers agency, and we follow her through that story there, and that was a cracking novel, absolutely great. And then this is the next instalment where basically Holly is kind of in charge still of the Finders Keepers agency, but she's sort of, I don't want to say she's leading the criminal investigations in this book because she's not. She's kind of a side character actually in those investigations, but she's still a main character in this book, if you see what I mean. So yeah. Now, I didn't really know what I was going to think of this book, and I didn't really read any reviews of it going in. I've sort of withheld from doing that for the last year because when it comes to Stephen King's work, I really like to try and make my own mind up before I get into the book. I just know that quite a few people have an issue with Holly from when I read the last Holly book and looked at reviews. Now, Stephen King was the first person to say in the back of this book that when he wrote his first draft of this book, Tabitha, his wife, read it and said, "You can do better." So he had to go back and do an edit, do a rewrite of things, and I still get the impression from the afterwards that he's written in this book that he wasn't totally 100% happy with this book, but he decided to just let it go. And I do feel that myself in this book, I will say. So I really like Holly as a character, and I also really like Barbara and Jerome, who are kind of the supporting characters to Holly in these books. I think that they're all really great characters, but Barbara and Jerome are also in this, but they're not really playing a main part. They're kind of sort of getting on with their lives, and Holly's calling on them occasionally and they're doing her the odd favour. And that's kind of like how it's been throughout most of the books. But I did feel in this book that as a group, they're splitting further and further and further apart, and they really don't spend that much time together anymore. So that kind of just made me a little bit sad, if I'm honest, because I really do like them as a trio. So if he does write a further novel with these characters, I'd actually really like to see them come more back together. In this book, their relationship between the three of them felt very fractured. As I say, Holly is kind of involved in two different investigations that are going on in this book. So essentially we have two criminals going about their business, and they are sort of coming together across the country, committing whatever heinous acts they're committing, and Holly is sort of invited into investigations on both of them. So she's not actually given the reins to go and investigate these things herself. It's basically just the police occasionally ring her up and say, you know, like, on the sly, what do you think of this? And then there's this other sort of stalker who's going around, and basically she's sort of employed privately to be the bodyguard of the person this stalker is stalking. So she's kind of interested in that as well, but again, she's not really been employed to track this stalker down and stop them. So she's sort of a side character to both of these criminals and what's going on. Now, I did enjoy the two sort of sets of crimes that were going on. I thought that they were really interesting, but I felt that I wished Holly's involvement had been more. It kind of just felt like Holly got stuck in the middle of these two criminals as they kind of crossed over with each other. And I felt like the fact that the police occasionally rang her up about this one, I thought they was just sort of throwing breadcrumbs out to Holly to make sure that she was involved, to be seen to be involved in the book in solving these. And I also found it like highly unlikely, given that Holly didn't really have access to all of the stuff that the police were looking at, that she was coming up with ideas to sort of solve these things, you know, in 10 minutes of like looking at some data or a couple of sleepless nights, like thinking about things, you know. Whereas had she been really involved in the investigations, I would have believed her, you know, the conclusions that she'd come to. I would think that they, you know, I'd be more believing of that story. But in here, I kind of felt like there were two crimes that needed solving, and Stephen King didn't really know how to involve Holly in the crossover. So I felt like her involvement was kind of weak, and it could have been stronger. Her involvement could have been better, given that the book is really, you know, following her character as a main character. So I think that for me was a little bit of a disappointment, in that I wished Holly had had a more prominent role in her own book, if I'm honest. But as I say, I did enjoy the two crimes. I thought that they were quite well written. In Holly, I had criticised Stephen King for getting very, very political in some respects, and he just kept banging on about COVID. So whilst I thought Holly the story was an absolutely fantastic story, really creepy as well, I'd kind of marked that story down a little bit, because I just felt like every other page he was banging on about COVID, and I was like, I don't need to be reminded of it. I'm trying to read to get away from it. It's happened just a little bit too soon for somebody to be talking about it in that way. In this book, there isn't really that much of a mention of COVID. Holly still has her hang-ups on COVID, but she's sort of recovering from the face masking and continuous hand washing, and she's able to go out into society now and kind of enjoy herself. So that I was pleased to see that. However, other people may have a problem with some of the other politics in the book, because this is, I would say that this is really getting at, well, it's feminism, basically, because one of our main characters in here is basically fighting for women's rights in America, which is very, very political at the moment. Now, I personally didn't mind it. I actually kind of enjoyed it. Other people may have a problem, but this kind of fight that this woman is on also brings into question very strong political groups and activist churches that are in America. So again, if you're sort of offended by that, you may have a problem with this book. I was absolutely fine with it. So all in all, I would say that I really enjoyed this novel. I was really, really pleased to read another Holly novel. I just wish Holly had been a little bit more of a centre character in it. And for that reason, I'm going to give this a 4-star. I would definitely read this again. And if this ends up being the last Holly book, then so be it. I do kind of hope he writes another one just to give her a proper goodbye. But, you know, like, I appreciate that he can't crank out a new Holly book every year, and that it would be nice to have some other kinds of stories off him, because we had, I'd say he's finishing off the Talisman trilogy this year, so that kind of needed finishing off. And it would also be really nice if he would write just a standalone story. I don't feel like I've really read a proper standalone that's a recent one off Stephen King lately that wasn't involving Holly, so I've really enjoyed that too. So it really depends, like, I don't know, none of us really know what his plans are for his writing in the future, but, you know, if I was to think about this as with the collection of all the Holly books, I would quite happily sit down and read from Mr. Mercedes up until this one multiple times over the years because I've just really, really enjoyed this story. So yeah, totally recommend this if you're a Stephen King fan and you really enjoy the Holly stories. Okay, so the next book I picked up, I didn't actually realise how controversial it was until I started reading it, and then I started going on Goodreads and looking at some of the reviews. But yeah, so I picked up Ken Kesey's Or One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Now, I've been wanting to read this for some time. The premise really interests me. I have watched the film with Jack Nicholson. I think the film was released in like the early 1990s. And yeah, I have watched that, but I really don't remember it because I probably watched it like 20 years ago or so. So I don't really have much recollection of it. But basically, this is about a men's psychiatric hospital. And this is set in the 1960s. So it's post World War II. So as you can imagine, a lot of the men in there have been in the war, and some of their, psychiatric problems are probably brought on by the fact that they were in World War II. So there's probably like, PTSD and things going on in here. But there's actually a variety of different mental health problems. Now, we start this book from the point of view of a guy called Chief Browden. I think it's Browden, or was it Bowden? Bromden, that's it, Chief Bromden. And Chief Bromden is the longest serving patient on this psychiatric ward. He has been there since the end of World War II. So if we consider that, he's probably been there between 15 and 20 years, given the timeline here. And the only person that has been here longer on this ward is the head nurse, Nurse Ratchet. So he's narrating this book from his point of view, like what he can see happening in the ward and like his memories of the nurse and her behaviour towards other people, and then memories of his life as well. And then the story is kind of starting because we have a patient who's admitted one morning called McMurphy. And McMurphy is the guy who was played by Jack Nicholson in the film. And McMurphy is really outspoken, and he doesn't really seem like he has psychiatric problems to the other people in the ward. In fact, the other men in the ward kind of idolise him a little bit because they have kind of been beaten down by society, beaten down by the ward, medicated out of their minds almost. So they're just quite compliant and still and just happy to sit there all day and play jigsaws and not really think too much about anything. Whereas, McMurphy is kind of like, what are you all doing? Like, where are your balls, basically? And he's questioning them, he's questioning the establishment, and he basically is saying, I'm not really crazy. Like, I'm in here because I committed a crime, and he was on a farm having to do hard labour, and he didn't want to do it. He just wanted to have a life where he could, gamble, play poker, and be fed and housed in a nice place. So he managed to convince a judge that he was crazy, so he got labelled a psychopath and has now been sent to this psychiatric ward. And he's under the impression that he will serve out his prison sentence in the psychiatric ward and then go home. And it's kind of slipped his... Well, he just didn't realise that actually if you get committed into a mental hospital, the length of time you're there depends on when they actually want to let you go. So that now causes him a bit of a problem because essentially he's very outspoken, and he causes a lot of trouble on this ward. He causes a lot of trouble for Nurse Ratchet, and he thinks that he can just behave how he wants and the nurse is just going to have to take it. And through this book, he basically has to learn, no, actually, she's in charge, and if you wind her up, terrible things can happen to you, and you could be in here for quite a while. So basically, the chief is like, from the point of view who's writing the book, he's sort of writing about, McMurphy's entrance into the ward and McMurphy's like conversations and how kind of like his persona sort of changes over the weeks and how his mood changes and the sort of different fights that he's getting in with Nurse Ratchet, and how that's sort of playing out for him. Now, the chief is not exactly a totally reliable narrator in this either. So he is considered to be deaf and dumb by everybody in the ward, but he's not. He's actually can hear everything that's going on, and he actually can talk. So you're sitting there thinking, well, surely that means that he is mislabeled as having psychiatric problems and he shouldn't be in there. But actually, when he's like describing things that are going on and his surroundings, you can see that he's actually slipping into some kind of traumatic experience, which seems to be sort of linked to what happened to him in the war. So you can see that I've tabbed this a fair bit, and I've made even more notes. There are so many things that I could say about this book, and I really enjoyed this book, and I could see that there is a lot to say about this book. This this book is just under 300 pages long, and I feel like I could write a whole master's thesis on this book. There's so much to say about it. So rather than trying to say everything here, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a separate video to really get into this book and talk about it, because I think I'd really enjoy to do that as well. So hopefully some of you are thinking about reading this and would like to have a further discussion, or have read it and would like a further discussion. When I say that this is controversial, the reason that it's controversial is, this was published in 1962, and it's considered, the language in it is considered language of its time, and there is a lot of racism in this book, and there's also a lot of sexism, and that in itself needs to be spoken about, I think. But again, it's really difficult to condense that down into just a couple of minutes as a quick review in this video. So I'm really going to try and approach that properly and give it the conversation that it deserves in the full-length video about this book that I'm going to make. But yes, I would give this a 4.75. I would definitely read this book again, and I definitely think I'm going to try and get hold of the film again and watch it, because I really don't remember anything about the film, and I feel like what I do remember about the film doesn't quite match up to what happened in the book, so I'd be interested to see how that goes. Okay, so another book that I picked up is a novella, actually. Now, I don't read too many of those, but that's just because I normally like to get lost in a bigger book. But I read Yoko Ogawa's The Housekeeper and The Professor. Now, I read my first book by Yoko Ogawa last December when I read The Memory Police. And I actually did a separate video reviewing that book on its own, because again, I had a lot to say about that book, and I thought it was really, really interesting, and it was a really interesting approach to memory. Now, you'll know I like a book where we talk about memory, and it's set in a fictional story. And this book is also about memory, and this is what attracted me to this novella. Now, this was such a nice read, honestly. Yoko Ogawa really has a way with words, really, really, really beautifully written, absolutely beautiful prose. I think my main complaint with this book, because I gave this a 4.75, I didn't give this a 5, and the main complaint is I just wish there was more of it. However, I think, I'm just going to put that down because the light's shining off it. The reason why there can't be more of it is there isn't really a plot line in this book as such. It is like, we basically have this professor who only has, I think it's 80 minutes worth of memory, so just over an hour, not quite an hour and a half. He has his long-term memory from years and years and years ago, but he has absolutely no short-term memory due to an accident that he had. And basically, we are following this woman who is hired as a housekeeper to him by his, I think it was his sister or his sister-in-law, possibly. Basically hires this housekeeper, but it's really difficult because every morning that she goes in, he has forgotten who she is. So they have to go through this rigmarole where she has to try and make him comfortable and have him trust her, because obviously she's going to be in his house all day. Now, he is an absolutely fantastic mathematician, and does some of the most incredible maths. Now, I am not really that great at maths. I can get by, but I wasn't studying advanced maths at school, and I don't really know any of the concepts. And I don't know if Yoko Ogawa did, but she brings this maths into the story, but it's not done in a scary way at all. She explains everything so well. And basically the housekeeper brings her, I think he's 10 or 12-year-old son with her to work. And so she's talking about the conversations the professors have while he's trying to sort of teach her son maths concepts. But they are so well explained that even I understood them. And I was actually interested in maths by the end of this book. And I don't think anybody has really got me interested in maths ever. Honestly, it's always been one of them subjects where I've just thought, it's boring, I don't really like it, and I just turn off. But in this book, honestly, she should be a maths teacher, because I was like, oh, I want to find out about that. And I was actually thinking about the maths after I put the book down, and sort of the problems that it was posing. I was like actually having to think about what I was out on my run and stuff like that. So I really, really think that this was really well written. But yeah, so obviously this is a study of their time together over a small period of time. There's no major plot line going on in this book, so it could only really be a novella, to be honest. So I think that, you know, if we tried to stretch this out to about 500 pages, then I'd probably be complaining that the book was too long with no substance. But yeah, a really, really enjoyable read. And if you like maths, I recommend this. If you like books on memory, I recommend this. And if you like Yoko Ogawa's work, I'd also recommend this. Okay, so another book that I read this week was Jazz by Toni Morrison. So this was published in 1992. Earlier this year, for award-winning April, I had read Beloved, which is kind of like her foundational piece, and that won her, I think that won her the Pulitzer Prize in 1987, around about that time I want to say, but she also won the Nobel Prize for fiction based off of that book as well, and it took me about 2 weeks to recover from that book. It was so emotional and it was really, really well done, and basically Beloved is the start of a trilogy, and Jazz is the second book in that trilogy, and then I think Song of Solomon is the third one. Now, the reason that this is a trilogy is not because we're following the same characters that were in Beloved. We're actually like, is it 40? Yeah, we're about 40 years removed from the story in Beloved, because we're now set in 1926. So we are between World War I and World War II with Jazz. And we are following this woman and her husband, and they live in, I don't exactly know where it is in America. I'm gonna say it's, I'm not entirely sure, I've got to be honest. Like, I don't think it's that far from Baltimore, I think is what it said in there. But anyway, we have like the whole jazz scene kind of coming up. And so where they live, jazz is everywhere. There's music everywhere, and music plays a really key part of this novel. It's always there in the background, and different characters have different ideas about what that music represents. So to a lot of our characters in this book, jazz and the music scene here, it represents like freedom. But there's like another character that sees it as, you know, violent black music that like drives violent people, black people to commit violent crimes. So that was like quite an interesting divide in opinion on that. And essentially our couple who live here have not always lived here. They have migrated. So they used to both work in the sugarcane fields when they were much younger, and they got driven out by the locals, and the fields were set fire to. And so eventually they migrated with a lot of other black workers out of those fields up into the cities, basically. So yeah, one of the themes I can see going on in this book, which matches Beloved, is the fact that within the household in Beloved, we have a spirit which is haunting the members of that household. In particular, the mother of the household, like the woman in the household, is affecting her. And in this book, again, we have another household that has a ghost in it. And that ghost haunts actually, you know, the man and the woman in there equally. But we're kind of seeing the ghost more through the eyes of the woman, I would say. But we don't have the same kind of magical realism that we had in Beloved, where that ghost sort of takes on a form, if you see what I mean, in that it is moving stuff around or inhabiting our characters or anything like that. It's more the ghost is like in their memories, and it's sort of driving, you know, the relationship that they have with each other, and, you know, their ability to move forward with their life is based on the ghosts of the past of this one particular woman that's haunting them. The other theme that I think that we have as well, like we have in Beloved, is that both of these characters used to be slaves and eventually have found their freedom and are now living a free life. And they're, the way that they look at love and how that they love each other, or how that they would love their child and things like that, is something that they really think about. And I think, like, if you've read Beloved, that is quite a key theme, because there's a discussion about, if you have children and they're just taken off you, how do you really love them? Why would you bother in the first place? And if you can't guarantee that you would stay with a man, why would you love him if he's just going to be taken away and sold to somebody else? So again, these two characters have been together since they were in the fields, working together. But because I have that knowledge from Beloved about that discussion about love, I sort of feel that does carry on into this relationship a bit, while they're kind of examining how they fell in love with each other and did they have any other choices and things like that. So I think, we are seeing, like, again, the repercussions of, if you're owned by somebody and everything about you is owned, like, who you're allowed to date and how many children you can have, and if you can even have children, if that's sort of owned by white plantation owners, what have you got? And then when you are suddenly freed, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the fact that you are actually permitted to love? So again, I think that's a theme that carries on in that book. Also in Beloved, we have a theme of motherhood in difficult circumstances, and again, I think we see that through not exactly in the two main characters that we're following in this book, but in the secondary characters that these characters are related to. We see the difficulties and ideas around motherhood played out there as well. So I thought this was really beautifully written, and one of the things that I really like about the way that Toni Morrison writes, she's very poetic in a way that is beautiful, but you don't feel like you have to get a thesaurus out because you're excluded from understanding the sentence, because she has literally just thrown a load of huge words in that you're just like, I've never even heard of that word. What do you want about? I don't understand. She doesn't write like that. She doesn't alienate you, I don't think, from the text in that way at all. So she writes these really beautiful, poetic passages that are really, like, poignant observations of human beings and their feelings towards, other human beings or the situation. She just describes it so well, and I really do enjoy that, and I see that she was doing that in Beloved and she's doing that in this book, so I'm thinking that's probably a trait of how she writes, and that makes me really excited to pick up her further work. The other thing that she's doing in this book, which again was similar to Beloved, is the way that she unravels the story. Is you think, oh, okay, I don't remember them saying anything about that. And you flick back a few pages and you think, no, nobody said anything about that. And then actually what she's done is she's had two characters having a discussion, like, you're meant to know what they're on about, but you're not. It's just sort of further on through the book, it gradually gets drip fed back to you about what they were talking about, so you eventually understand later on in the book. And she did this in Beloved, and I find that a little bit confusing, if I'm honest. So that's not exactly my favourite style, to go around telling a story. Like, I'd rather you just say up front what the thing is. I don't like to think that, oh, they've said something and I don't understand it, but I don't know if I should know something about it, because the way that it's been written is like I should know something about it, but actually I don't know anything about it because I'm not privy to what's happening in those characters' heads at that point in time. Yeah, so I find that a little bit confusing. On the whole, I would give this a 4.25. I think the only reason, as I say, that I wouldn't give it a 5 is just that style of storytelling where you're, slowly unravelling something in a way, in the way that I've just described, is not really my favourite way of telling stories. However, her language and the way she writes is really, really beautiful. And also, this book is not very big. I mean, this book is around 230 pages, but this is a really complex story with some complex characters going on in this. So I think that she's done that really, really, really well as well. So again, if you're a Toni Morrison fan, I definitely recommend this one. It's not as, it doesn't seem as violent as Beloved. I don't think I'm going to need 2 weeks to recover from this like I did Beloved, but it's given me a lot to think about, and I did enjoy this. Okay, so we've actually been really, really busy this week, and I have a fifth one to talk about, which is Anthem by Ayn Rand. So this is really tiny, really, really tiny. So this is just about a novella, I think. So this was published in 1938 in the UK, and it was published in the USA in 1946. Now, Ayn Rand is a Russian author, and she is obviously, if this is getting published in 1938, she wrote this in the 1930s, she will be finding herself in socialist Russia that's basically barreling into communism. And Ayn Rand is not a communist in any way. Ayn Rand believes in the self, she believes in I, and she believes in the philosophy that you should be able to look after yourself before having to worry about the herd. She's not a we person at all, and she also believes in the government not interfering with what you're doing. She believes in a laissez-faire attitude to all things. Now, I have never read anything by Ayn Rand before, but she does have a really famous book out called Atlas Shrugged. And I did see that and thought that sounds really interesting, because I'm actually quite interested in Russian history. And especially like the communist era, I'm quite interested in that. So when I saw Atlas Shrugged, I was like, that looks interesting, but it's about 700 pages long and the text is really tiny in the book that I saw. So I wanted to try and read something smaller by her to get a feel for her writing, to see if actually I would want to invest in a 700-page book. This book was only 40 pages long. Now, I'd say this is bigger than a normal size book as well. So this is a normal size book and this is this one. And in the cover and everything, there is nothing about, it just goes straight into the story. There's nothing about who printed it or anything like that. And I was sort of searching for that, and then on the back page it sort of gave the name of a printers, and I followed that up, and this is actually been printed by the Kindle Free platform, which is kind of probably why it does look like somebody just folded some A4 paper in half and printed some words on it and then put it in a front cover. So I don't particularly like this cover. I think it's pretty nasty, if I'm honest, but I got it quite cheaply. I think it was about £2.50 off Amazon. So as I was using it just as a sampler for Ayn Rand, I was like, that's fine, that's fine. But you can buy this in a proper book format, I've since discovered. I think it's by Penguin Classics, like the same people who, the Penguin Modern Classics, the same people who did this style of book, they also do Ayn Rand's books. Confusingly, their version of this is 110 pages long, or 120 pages. So I don't know how this is only 40, but maybe it's all to do with the type of text that they, you know, the text size and everything that they put in the book. But anywho, we digress. So yeah, this obviously wasn't published in Russia when it came out, because obviously that would have put her in a lot of danger for her ideas. But yeah, it was published in the UK first in 1938. This is interesting, I would say. I'm gonna put it down because the light's shining off it. But basically, we have our main character who is called Equality 72521. And in this book, none of our characters sort of have a name like Ben or James or Sarah. Like, everybody's called Equality with a number, or some other kind of word like community with a number or something like that. And basically, we start out with this person who is in hiding, and they are writing their thoughts down on some paper that they've stolen in a secret tunnel underground of the city. And they're having to do it like this because essentially they're not allowed to have like their own things. They're not allowed to have their own thoughts. They're always meant to be involved in community activities. And basically in this, well, it's a dystopian world that she's built, but I think that it's basically a very extreme extension as to probably the society that she was currently in at the time. But basically it's illegal to think about yourself. Like, you only exist for the good of other people, essentially, is what our character is going through in this book. But as I said, they found a way to sort of escape every so often and write their thoughts down about what they think. And then basically something happens where they manage to sort of break away. And they sort of reach a point in this book where it's really not possible to pretend that they're still following the rules. Now, it's only 40 pages long, so it's not a terribly intricate story or anything like that, but I think it's quite interesting. It's an interesting view into Ayn Rand's mind, probably, as to, this is her version of 1984 almost, but like how she viewed the regime that she was living in was probably going to get to, I think, from this book. I think that this could have been bigger, if you see what I mean. I think she had some really good ideas in this book that could have been developed much further than they actually were. So personally, I would only give this a 3-star because there's just not enough in it to kind of grip my attention. I did read this all in one sitting, as I said, because it was only 40 pages long, but to actually make this story stick and become a classic like 1984 was, I think that the story just needed developing more. And it felt like this wasn't really about the story. It felt like this was a way to have a political viewpoint about what was happening to her and just getting it out there to other places. And it is basically hitting you over the head on every page with what her viewpoint is, which is, interesting. I think that this would probably be a good one to study in schools because it's not too long. And it's not inaccessible. I don't think the language used in it is particularly difficult to understand. But from a story perspective, I think that it, as I said, it could have been expanded, and you could have got a lot more out of it than what she did. But I don't think that that's what she wanted to get out of it. I think she just wanted her viewpoint known outside of Russia, I think. So yeah, 3-star. So I have read 5 things in this last week, so I've had actually a really, really, really busy week reading. However, saying that, not all of those books were particularly big books. The Stephen King one that I started off with was obviously the largest one. That was like just over 400 pages. And then, Jazz was not a particularly big book. Housekeeper and The Professor was a novella. Anthem is a novella, So, I read lots of smaller books this week. So let me know in the comments down below if you've read any of the books that I've read this week and what you think of them. I'm also really intrigued to find out what you thought about the final Holly Gibney instalment, and did it meet your expectations? How did you feel about it? What would you have rated it? And do you want Stephen King to do another Holly Gibney book? Because I think I do, to be honest. So yeah. If you've enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see my future content, please press the subscribe button. And as I said, I am going to do a more in-depth review of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So just keep your eyes peeled in the next 2 weeks for that one coming up. I'm also going to be doing my end of month retrospective for this month, which will also be coming out in the next few weeks as well. And I've got an exciting video coming out for you next week with a reading vlog. So I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.